Welcome to the Science Salon podcast. I'm your host, Michael Shermer. My guest this week is Mel Konner. His new book is Believers, Faith in Human Nature. Mel is a biological anthropologist and a medical doctor, by the way. He's the Samuel Chandler Dobbs Professor in the Department of Anthropology and the program in Neuroscience and Behavioral Biology at Emory University. He's the author of Women After All, Becoming a Doctor, and The Tangled Wing, which I remember reading back in the 1980s, about the biological constraints on human nature. So we cover that and a lot. We pretty much cover all the big topics related to anthropology, the nature of human nature, the nature of violence, how violent were our ancestors versus today. But mainly the primary focus of the conversation is on religion. What is it? Such a big subject. What was it in hunter-gatherer societies? He lived for 2 years amongst a hunter-gatherer tribe in Africa. And what's the role of spirituality, the nature of the supernatural to hunter-gatherers peoples, the fact that hunter-gatherers actually are pretty good inductive reasoning scientists in terms of their tracking and hunting, and most of what they do in interaction with each other and the environment is same thing we do. So the role of religion and the supernatural has other roles to play than just explaining causality. And so we get into a lot of that, and all the way up to what kind of political system we should have today that taps into the best of our hunter-gatherers and avoids the worst part of their lives. So with that, I give you Melvin Konner, MD, Believers, Faith in Human Nature. Thanks for listening. So you describe yourself as a secular Jew. You're an atheist. You were raised religious in a kind of a culturally Jewish family and so forth. So walk us through a little bit about your own, shall we call it, faith journey to how you got to where you are today and how you came to write this book all the way back to your upbringing.
So I was born in Brooklyn, New York, in a mixed neighborhood right after World War II. My grandfather and grandmother lived with us. My grandfather was an Orthodox Jew. My mother followed his. And I was raised in a household where my grandfather was praying every day and going to synagogue faithfully and keeping the Sabbath and keeping a kosher home and so on. So, and I was trained in that, raised in that tradition. I went to public schools, but I went to the synagogue Hebrew school every day of the week, basically, from age 8 till 16 or so, 15. And I encountered at that time, I was very interested that you start the moral arc with a scene of Martin Luther King Jr. speaking to the audience of demonstrators, I guess, in 1965. I was at the I Have a Dream speech.
Oh, wow.
1963.
Wow.
And it was 2 days before my 17th birthday.
Oh my God, that must have been a life changer.
It was a big deal. I wouldn't say that my beliefs changed overnight, but getting involved in the integration movement and the anti-war movement became very morally very important to me as a 16-year-old and in the ensuing years. And as much as I loved my rabbi, he wasn't really stepping up in that particular moral sense. So there was that. There was also starting college, taking philosophy, and being exposed to a modern analytic philosophical viewpoint, and questioning even the meaning of words like God, and so that affected me. And there are also personal details like unrequited love and and the other hazards of youth.
Of growing up, yes.
Uh, I gradually and of course very importantly I became more and more convinced that the real origin story was evolution, and decided to study biological anthropology, and that's really I was still in my last year of high school when I conceived the idea that would ultimately result in the tangled wing that you mentioned. I wanted to know. I knew then that I wanted to know everything there was to know scientifically about the basis of human nature, and I didn't realize that wasn't a very big ambition at that time, because practically nothing was known, and also because, and one of the reasons that practically nothing was known was that there was a strong academic and liberal prejudice against using any biological term in the same sentence with any aspect of human psychology or behavior.
And is that because of what happened in World War II with genocide and the Holocaust and all the negative side effects of eugenics, kind of a pushback against that?
Yes, I think that was a big part of it, and as I said, I was raised in a religious Jewish family, and certainly, as I was learning to talk during the Nuremberg trials, and then these revelations were coming to be very commonly understood. I grew up in that very shocking cultural.
Yeah.
And shocked cultural atmosphere. And it's I don't want to get into this too much, but it's an interesting fact that anthropologists played a very strong role, anti-fascist role in intellectual discourse during the 20s, 30s, and 40s.
You mean like Margaret Mead? And Boaz?
Margaret Franz Boas was very prominent. Ashley Montague was a biological anthropologist. Sherwood Washburn at Berkeley. They were confronting racial theories of some people's superiority and other people's inferiority with very, very, what I think are very powerful ideas about cultural relativism, cultural differences, and they were extremely opposed to any sort of biologizing of behavior.
Yeah, they're often criticized and lumped into the blank slaters, but on the other hand, their critiques of those late 19th century racial hierarchy theories were pretty spot on, right?
Yes, absolutely spot on, and I think every historical figure in intellectual life has to be interpreted in their context. In that context, I think they played a very important role and did the right thing. But as time went on, and in the late '60s. People like William Hamilton and a little later Bob Trivers and E.O. Wilson and Richard Dawkins started to develop very strong theoretical propositions about behavior, not just human behavior, but behavior generally, and in fact, a lot of the power of their reasoning came from the breadth, the zoological breadth of the species that they were able to apply their and test their theories against, and by that time, I had already become convinced that in a mechanistic sense there was. That everything about human behavior would ultimately be explainable by reference to the brain, that a certain amount of it would be explainable by reference to genes that influence the brain, that a lot would still be attributable to culture and learning and education, of course. But when what was then called sociobiology, or sometimes neo-Darwinian theory, in my mind came into my mind, and I resisted it for a while, and then didn't, because it was too powerful and valuable. It fit very well with my sense about biological mechanisms being a valid way to approach the explanation of behavior.
Yeah.
And by that time, I was sort of in the from my second semester in college, I was in the category, the famous remark of Lavoisier about God, which is that is a hypothesis that I really don't have a need for.
Laplace. That was Laplace. Yeah.
Laplace.
Yeah. But Mel, before we lose that thread, let me just ask you as a sidebar here on politics. Today, people describe, the American politics as never more divided. And I think, well, I was in college during Watergate, and things were pretty heated then. And you were in Watergate, you were in college, during the year of 68, the volatile, in the heat of the Vietnam War, and Johnson and the meltdown and all that stuff. Does it feel like it's really worse now, or is this a kind of a presentism bias that we have, that in fact it's always been kind of polarizing?
Well, I think it's the latter. I think certainly I tend to smile indulgently when younger people tell me that the country has never been as divided as it is now, and for just the reasons that you described. It was much more divided in the 60s, and the successive assassinations of John F. Kennedy and Dr. King and Robert Kennedy, and the riots in every major American city, and the really severe racial divide, and the liberal versus conservative divide. You could say that was a high point in modern times, but then you just go a step further backwards to the era of fascism, and maybe you don't see the United States quite as divided, but you see the world divided in a way that was far more scary and vicious. And also the world that I grew up in was the world in which we thought there could be a nuclear war at any moment, and
right.
I'm very I think very much as you present the case in the moral arc, that progress is real, that there are it is two steps forward, one step back, and I could say that the country is a lot more divided today than it was 5 or 10 years ago. But that's how it goes. I think we're in a temporary phase of that has some very serious problems attached to it, and there'll be some lasting damage. But progress will resume on the climate change front, and on the racial front, and on the gender front. It's already vigorously proceeding. Even under the present circumstances, it make a lot of us very uncomfortable.
Yeah, I think so, and that's good to have some perspective on that. Back to our previous thread, you were also coming online intellectually during Stanley Milgram's shock experiments and Phil Zimbardo's Stanford prison experiment. These are two Jewish social scientists trying to understand how you turn educated, cultured Germans into killing Nazis. And their thesis really is it's the environment. It's these are not bad apples. It's the barrel that's bad that turns them rotten. And that you could take, as Milgram famously said, I could convert college students, white American middle-class college students, into throwing 350 volts into somebody just by the command of authority. So again, that was kind of a pushback against that biological argument.
Well, Yes and no. I mean, by the way, I was very impressed with your small replication of the
Oh yeah.
Milgram experiment that I read with great interest in the moral arc. I don't think anybody else has actually dared
It's hard to get permission to do that.
to replicate that
Yeah.
before, I seem to got similar results. And Milgram also found some people resisting the orders, but not most people. And I remember this one subject of his was of German heritage, and when she utterly refused to go on with the shocking, and she was debriefed, she said, "Well, maybe we've just been through too much." And so, yeah, people change. But what does it mean that it's that easy to bring this out of people?
Yeah.
It doesn't just mean that people are completely malleable. It means that people have inclinations. That their inclination to follow authority is often stronger than their empathy for or sympathy for another person's pain. That's a balance, and their willingness to inflict pain on another person very knowingly is unfortunately an aspect of human nature that those experiments drew on.
And other details of it, though, I think help flesh out your answer to your question, which is it's complicated, in as much as a lot of them had to be trained to do this. Himmler there's a famous speech he gave at Poznan where he's kind of upbraiding his generals and leaders of the Einsatzgruppen to buck up and get tough because a lot of the soldiers didn't want to kill at close range, particularly with firearms, because blood and brain would splatter all over the place, which is why, in part, they shifted to gassing. But after a while, if they did it enough, they could kind of get used to it. But even there's a lot of stories about these guys just getting shit-faced afterwards because they were so just distraught over the whole thing that they had done, and that they would just get plastered until the next day. Yeah, so it's not that easy.
Some accounts that have them drunk during the mass shootings, even not just after.
Yeah,
it's not, it's not trivial, but maybe the book Ordinary Men.
Yeah, I read that book.
I mean, that's a very instructive story because it's about not a regular German army unit. It's certainly not an SS unit. It's sort of a quasi-police unit that drew on middle-aged men from small towns and sent them into the Balkans and Greece during the period of mass shootings. And there's no evidence that they were threatened if they didn't carry out the orders, and they almost all just did the shootings, and the title "Ordinary Men" tells you a lot. It'd be interesting to know if you could do the Milgram experiment with a large enough number of people, would there be a sex difference? And I guess I would predict that there would be, and that women would be, despite their submissive position in society, they would be more likely to be the ones who say, "I can't do this anymore."
Particularly the shocking. It's such a viscerally shocking thing to do. Although Milgram found that if the person was in the same room, if the learner was in the same room with the teacher, he was less likely to shock him, and even less likely if they had to take the person's hand and put it on the metal plate to get the shock, they were even less likely to go through with it. So, those are the kind of factors that show the spectrum of human behavior that can be expressed or not, depending on the conditions. So more anonymity, you can't see them, they're in another room, you're just given this anonymous order by a guy in a lab coat, That's one thing versus you're in the room with them. You actually have to physically touch them. Much harder to kill somebody when you have to do that. So that gets
when the Nazis got to the point of gas chambers, they were really remote from
yeah.
from the actual.
Now you lived for 2 years with a hunter-gatherer group in Africa. To what extent did that kind of affect your perspective of human nature, and what did you gain from that? And to what extent do you feel that represents those kinds of people, whether it's the Yanomamo or the Papua New Guineans that Jared Diamond has studied, that represents our ancestry hundreds of thousands of years ago, or is it problematic to lean too much on those sort of natural experiments?
Well, to quote something you said earlier, it's complicated. Those are three very different kinds of societies that you mentioned. So,
yeah,
the Bushmen are sort of classical hunter-gatherers living in small bands of about 30 people or 20 to 40, something in that range. Semi-nomadic. They're not moving all the time, but they're moving every few months at least, and living at least at the time they were first studied strictly by hunting and gathering. Yanomamo already depend substantially on horticulture.
Yeah.
As well as hunting and gathering. They're in a much more densely populated environment, and the Papua New Guineans are along the same, more or less the same continuum, are in a far more densely populated situation where the main source of food is not hunting and gathering, but horticulture and keeping livestock, mostly pigs. I was actually kind of surprised when I saw Jared Diamond taking them as a sort of paradigm for yesterday, and we've become much more reticent about taking people like the Bushmen as a paradigm for yesterday, and because first of all, as the good studies have accumulated, and I'll tell you the ones that really belong in the category of potentially having to say something to say about our ancestry. It's not just the Bushmen, but also the Hadza, the Aceh of Paraguay that Hill and Hurtado studied, the Australian Aborigines, any group of people who live all or almost all by hunting and gathering. We consider in anthropology, at least some of us consider especially if they're in tropical climates and they're not mounted hunters like the Great Plains Native Americans. They have something to say about our ancestral adaptation. They're not psychologically or biologically more primitive than we are, but they're living in circumstances that all of us once lived in, and they show quite a bit of variation among themselves. That's important to know, and so if you want to make a generalization, you have to look at a lot of different hunting and gathering societies, and also ultimately you have to test your hypotheses against the archaeological record, which is where the data about what happened in the past are now. That record misses an awful lot of things, but it also includes a lot of things. And so, long story short, we try to judiciously apply information gleaned from modern studies, scientifically oriented studies of living hunter-gatherers, combine it with the archaeological record and try and figure out something about our past. but it's not a simple exercise, and it's
reminds me of paleo diet people. They go, I'm going to eat like our Paleolithic ancestors ate. It's like, which ones? The Inuit that ate mostly meat and blubber, or the Yanomamo that eat mostly plants? Which diet?
Well, I've been involved in that myself, and have had to fend off people who make assumptions about what I think based on paleo diet fads.
What is your opinion of paleo diet fads?
Well, first of all, there's a range. The way we approach it now is that there's a range of variation, as you say. Certainly, there's no justification in the record for either archaeologically or ethnographically for extreme claims about diet being mostly flesh. There is also no basis for saying that those people are vegetarians. Certainly, none of them could afford to be vegetarians. All of them included flesh as a substantial part of their diets. But if you look at the whole range, you get something like a 50-50 split with a wide, with a pretty wide bell-shaped curve around that. And what I like to say is it's easier to specify what our ancestors didn't eat than what they did eat.
Right.
And because you can say that they did not eat refined carbohydrates. Some of them
right.
had substantial amounts of honey, but refined carbohydrates make up a huge proportion of average American diets today, and they were non-existent in that ancestral period. And then you get to things like salt and some other dietary components where there's a little more room for argument. But I like to say, well, I can't tell you exactly what you should eat, but I can tell you what you shouldn't eat.
Don't eat. All right, not too much sugar, refined carbohydrates. Right, lots of plants, fresh fruit, good meat.
Right, but
vary your diet. Yeah. Now, when
varying the diet also ensures a range of micronutrients and vitamins that is missing from a lot of diet of agricultural people.
Now, one of the points you make in the new book, Believers, is that the word religion is also one of these terms that's so broad. What do you mean when you talk about religion? So start off by just giving us a sense of those 2 years you spent with these hunter-gatherers. What would they conceive of religion or spirituality or whatever the right word is?
So sometimes people claim, some anthropologists claim that in these kind of small-scale societies, so-called primitive societies, people don't actually distinguish between the real world and the spirit world because the spirit world is so real to them. But I would say that the Bushmen did distinguish between the real world and the spirit world. They think that and thought that the spirit world could impinge on the real world. And I remember one time a guy losing his pipe and going back to look for it where he thought he dropped it, and after looking for it for quite a while, he couldn't find it, and he came back and he said "Amasi," which is a word for spirits, meaning they disappeared his pipe somehow, and they come down and make people sick, and that's why the central ritual, the central religious ceremony in which all their beliefs are sort of focused is the trance dance, which is a communal effort in which women sing and clap and men dance around in a circle. Sometimes women also get involved. Some women are healers, but the belief is that by going into trance, healers get get power that comes from the spirit world, and they can leave their bodies in trance, and they have to be brought back. It's a risky enterprise for them, and they can visit what's called the village of the spirits, and there they may see their ancestors. They may see one or another of the numerous gods. They don't have a reverential attitude toward God, and even Darwin's definition of religion includes reverence, and that's not part of the Bushman conception of their gods. They're
How did they visit this?
They're resentful and even contemptuous of the gods and spirits in many cases.
How did they visit this other world? Did they do it through medicinal plants, hallucinogens, or through meditation, or?
The trance dance, which has been studied by many observers, it hasn't been studied with the viewpoint of trying to see what brain activity is going on, but everyone who's observed it is convinced and really go into trance, and they seem to do it without drugs, although sometimes drugs are involved in their training, plant-based substances are involved in their training, but I think it's clear that they can dance themselves into trance. I mean, they dance very monotonously for hours, and maybe smoke inhalation is a factor, and focusing, staring into the fire, and then they learn to concentrate, and it's a discipline like you see in some Eastern religions with yogis and other meditation experts who can create marked changes in their brain activity and even lower their body temperature a little bit without drugs. So that's a state in which they believe they leave their bodies, and after this is over, they'll come back and describe what they saw. It's important to understand that in a small-scale society or any society that doesn't have a written language, there are limits to the to the consensus you can get there about what the gods are and who they are and different people go and see them and bring back somewhat consistent, but certainly not completely consistent reports. So there's no dogma, nothing which you could say, I know that these 6 things are true about the gods, and this one does this and that one does that, and that other people are going to believe you. It's not like that. The extent that people have faith, and there are doubters. If you know Jennifer Heck's book called Doubt.
Yeah, I know that book. Yeah, I know Jennifer. Yeah,
thick book about the whole history of doubt, which is easily as old as religion and religious faith itself. And that's consistent with what I said earlier about the genetic variation in religiosity.
Yeah.
There always has been a tendency for some people to believe more than others, and for others to say, well, people come back from Bushmen healers come back from the world of the spirits, and they tell what they saw, and some people listen with rapt attention, and some people say, well, maybe, and but certainly their relationship to their environment is one that I would say is based on a simple form of something very like science.
You mean the religion plays a role of trying to explain the world, why things happen?
Yes, and so they know about how they discovered it over the generations. Nobody knows, but they know about 2 genera of beetles. The larvae of which contain in the thoracic area a poison that they put on their arrows and that can bring down a giraffe. all they have to do is pierce the skin. And people, one guy cut his foot off because he stabbed himself with an arrow, and it started to swell up. So they understand take that one example, they understand how to find what bushes the larvae of those two beetles can be found under. They know how to prepare the arrow poison. They know that it will, from trial and error, that it will poison an animal, a game animal, including a large one, if they break the skin. Mm-hmm. And they know there's something like a science of tracking.
Yeah.
And inference, process of inference that can be very impressive and almost science-like. I mean, I don't want to carry this too far.
I've written about that. We published Louis Lederberg's article in Skeptic about tracking as a form of science. It's an inductive science.
Yeah, well, I'd like to read that because I remember going out hunting with a guy one day, and we were we left in the pre-dawn light, and we were following. He picked up the trail of an antelope. I don't remember which one it was. We were following the tracks, and he said, "This was here this morning. We were going to be able to find this guy, this thing, and shoot it." And then he at one point he looked closely at the ground, and he stopped and he shook his head and said, "No. It was last night. It wasn't this morning." And I said, "How do you know that?" And he made me kneel down, and he pointed at a mouse track that was on top of the hoof.
Right.
And this was a crepuscular mouse, which dated the hoof print to hours before and too long before to.
Well, that's some pretty serious inductive reasoning right there.
Yes, and the spirit world wasn't mentioned as a factor at all.
Right.
So I mean, you have in a hunter-gatherer society with a very relatively simple social structure and no written language, no machinery, no traditions, and that are similar to ours. Only folk traditions, and yet they have a tremendous knowledge of their environment and test hypotheses about the animals they depend on for food and about even about things like changes in the seasons and rain clouds and so on.
Now you're mildly critical of the new atheist movement in your new book, Believers, in part because when they say religion is nothing but, you counter, well, it's a whole bunch of things. So if someone like Richard Dawkins says, well, if science replaces religion as the best mechanism for explaining causality in the world, then religion will disappear. I don't know if Richard actually says that, but there's a lot of atheists that think like that. Your counter to that would be something like, well, religion plays roles separate from causality, that they had a full understanding of causality, like you just explained. Religion is something else on top of that. I use an example, if I just give one example in the Moral Arc I think it was from the Aceh, where I was writing about witchcraft. And they have an understanding like the mud hut fell, it collapsed because of termites. And they understand that termites rot the wood or whatever of not the mud hut, but the wooden hut. But for them, it was the timing of the collapse that, somebody was not in the hut when it collapsed, or they were there when it collapsed, and the timing of it and the meaningful of it, that had some supernatural elements added onto it related to what we might call religion. But that was separate from what the cause of the collapse was, something like that. So how would you disentangle those?
Well, first of all, I'll only go so far in defending religion. And, part of what provoked me to write this book was the what I considered extreme attacks on religion by Dawkins and Sam Harris and Dan Dennett, Christopher Hitchens, and the famous quartet. But there are others that have a lot of followers. Bertrand Russell in his time was not somebody who aggressively attacked religion the way they do, but certainly somebody who was openly contemptuous of it. So was Francis Crick, co-discoverer of structured DNA, and people have more. People who are not believers have more or less patience with religious people, depending on our own inclinations, and partly because I grew up religious and understand what it's like from the inside, and partly because I think it's an empirical question whether religion does more harm than good. And we don't really know for sure yet. We see tremendous evidence of the evil done by certain kinds of fanatical religious people, but if you wanted to let's say you wanted to do a thought experiment and say, well, if I could wave a magic wand and eliminate religion from the world, would the world be a better place or a worse place or not changed?
Yeah.
And Dawkins and Harris and Dennett are, I'd say, 100% convinced that it would be a much better place if you waved that magic wand. But if you wanted to approach that thought experiment scientifically and with real data, you would have, 2 columns in your digital document. One would be
Right.
harm done by religion, the other would be good done by religion, and you would list them as best you could. I don't say it would be easy or always completely scientific, but at least you would try to do that. And they don't try to do that. They only list the harms done by religion, and add to that if you paraphrase Bertrand Russell's many writings on this subject, it sort of adds up to it's better not to believe in things for which there is no evidence.
Yeah.
And I agree with that. It's better not to believe in things for which there is no evidence. But you notice that that's a value judgment. That's a value statement. That's not a statement that can be proved. I think we know wonderful volumes about the positive things that result from believing in things that do have evidence. That's what science is, and we get great benefits from that all the time. But we're not in as good a position to say that no one should believe anything for which there's no evidence.
Is that what you mean by when you say, huh? In your trichotomy here, I believe that God exists. I don't believe that God exists. I can't tell for sure whether God exists, sort of theist, atheist, and the popular meaning of agnostic. And then you add to this a fourth answer, which is, huh? Which is shorthand for, I don't understand you, or I don't get it. What do you mean by that?
Well, this is very much what I learned from my professor in my first semester at Brooklyn College. His name was Martin Lean. He was an analytic philosopher, and he said most people think there are 3 positions on God, but actually there are 4, and here's the 4th. Now, it depends on what you're telling me about God. And, you tell me that God is an old guy with a beard sitting on a golden throne up in the sky, and I'll say, oh, I don't believe in that. It's like Bertrand Russell's celestial teapot. And if you tell me that the God is a spirit inside a tree, I'll say I don't believe that. But if you say something to me like, well, God is the spirit that moves the universe, or God is the essence of life, or God is love, then I say, huh? Because love is love, life
Right.
is life,
Right.
the universe is the universe, and so there you're doing some kind of intellectual move that I can't understand.
What do you
And
say to somebody who says, "Well, God is the universe, or created the laws of the universe and stepped back," sort of a deist position? It's not testable, really, because God is out of the picture now. We don't have an explanation for where the laws of nature came from in the first place. They were just there with the Big Bang in the beginning of time. We're kind of left with this. I'm not sure if it's quite a I don't know what you're talking about answer, or I don't know.
yeah, well, I think I do know that I don't need a supernatural force to explain love, and one of the purposes I had in the two editions of the Tangled Wing, and more or less everything that I've done in my intellectual career, is to try and explain things like love, pity, anger, grief, joy, exaltation, hatred, even faith, uh, by reference to the mechanisms of biology and to the real origin story of some evolutionary background, which I don't say is easy to understand, but it's there.
So, what's
So
the biological basis and evolutionary origins of faith?
Well, the again, there's so many different things included in religion or faith, and that it's hard to give a simple answer to the question, because the field is in its infancy. Somebody coined the term neurotheology, which is an interesting way to describe the search for faith in the brain. People have done very good studies using magnetic resonance imaging, and for example, in which they asked Carmelite nuns to go into a scanner and try and remember the most important experience that they had with God since they joined the convent, and also the most important experience they had in a human relationship. And after the nuns said, "Are you kidding me?" They were good sports and they did it, and there are somewhat different brain circuits activated in those two cases. Then somebody else does a study of prayer versus reading a poem versus something about Santa Claus, and there are differences there too. But that's not like the challenge that was given to the Carmelite nuns. That's a different aspect of religion that's being studied. And then Sam Harris, who went on to get a doctorate in neuroscience, studied belief, and he wanted to know if there was a difference between what was going on in the brain when somebody said yes to "Do you believe in eagles?" versus saying yes to "Do you believe in angels?" Mm-hmm. And he was impressed with the overlap, but his published research also shows some differences. And then there are lots and lots of other studies, things that people becoming more religious or less religious as a result of certain kinds of brain damage, and many studies now of brain waves and brain activity during meditation and altered states of consciousness. And so I think we're at the beginning of this. The famous guy Persinger came up with the God spot, and
I did his God helmet thing.
Oh, did you?
Yeah, I did. I had a mild experience, unlike Dawkins, who had no experience. I kind of felt a little bit out of body and sense presence. Although, to be frank, when you're in a room, darkened, in a big easy chair with no sound and no light, and you're just sitting there for an hour, you kind of drift off anyway into a kind of fantasy land. much like those flotation tanks that people are doing now, which I've done. Same kind of thing. So I think without more controls, it's hard to say what the cause of that was.
Yeah, and in fact, when some people tried to do randomized control studies replicating the God spot effect, they got nothing.
Right.
In several studies. So, you could say it's an open question, but if it were to be a real effect, let's say your experience was the result of this very, very, very minuscule stimulation that the God helmet gives you. It's much smaller than the transcranial magnetic stimulation that's routinely used in psychological studies these days. But let's say your experience was real. I would say that doesn't prove the existence of a God spot. It proves that spot is part of a circuit that I like to call the God map, and that if you imagine a complex map in the brain of different circuits that conspire to produce the belief in things unseen, the confidence in something like life after death, which is something that Buddhists, who are basically atheists, and Jews and Christians have in common. I've talked to Buddhist monks about this just to get away from God, her, or himself for a moment. When the most advanced monks have talked to me about reincarnation, I said, well, it almost never is possible for someone to remember anything about their past lives. Huh. And you ask them about what actually passes from the person who dies into the new person being born, they will give you a very erudite, complicated explanation, which leads me to say, huh? Right. Because I can't imagine what that would be. But they can, and they believe in it very, very strongly, and their whole lives are organized around the thought that they have to do the right thing.
To many Western theists, all these arguments you've just made, and many more in your book, are evidence that God put in our brain these areas so that we can communicate with the deity. What does an anthropologist say to that? With some research on brain evolution and so on, what's the purpose of those functions in the brain?
Well, as I think there's dispute among evolutionary theorists and anthropologists about whether faith and religion generally represent some sort of specific adaptation that was selected for.
Yeah.
Which is kind of what Darwin implies when he brings up the subject briefly, and I think it's The Descent of Man, or whether it's the byproduct of having an extremely complex brain.
Yeah, what do you think it is?
Well, or something that has just to do with communal exercises and what are called costly displays of commitment, and which lead to respect in the group and potentially increased reproductive success, or maybe if you're a group selectionist, they lead to better functioning in the group. But what I see in true religious faith is which as many people readily concede overlaps with certain kinds of brain pathologies like manic depressive illness or epilepsy or even brain damage and dissociative states and so on, all sorts of things that very religious people, including founders of new religions, have that just don't seem adaptive to me. For anything else, but somehow people have this, and it survived our evolution. Still it still exists in a minority of people, and then there are other people who are impressed by it and feel like they can go along in their belief systems with this. Now, I don't say that costly displays of commitment are unimportant in the evolution of religion. I don't say that that there aren't some ways in which the byproduct of the huge and very valuable human cognitive apparatus sort of spills over for some people into faith. But I just see what I see is something too behaviorally and psychologically impressive and distinct from ordinary thought processes.
Yeah.
To be nothing but a byproduct.
Yeah. A little bit like the debate on the adaptive purpose of music and art. Are there adaptive functions to it? Like Jeffrey Miller argues that there might be some sexual selection behind it, where, say, males try to display, like male peacocks that display their the fanned feathers. Men recite poetry or write music or do architecture or whatever to impress women. Something like that. I'm oversimplifying this, but that is an adaptive purpose to it. Where someone like
I don't have a problem with that.
But someone like Pinker might say, I think he calls it cheesecake, non-adaptive cheesecake, or I forget. It's almost more like a Gould-like spandrel. It's just a byproduct of something else. I'm not sure how to find the answer to that question, but I would put religion in that same problem to solve.
Well, I mean, if you look at the number of sex partners that Mick Jagger has had in his life,
right,
or for that matter, Michael Johnson, it's just it's not. If it's a man, the sexual selection argument in favor of lots of special abilities, including music and writing and painting and athletics and superior athletic performance, and these demonstrably result in increased sexual opportunities for men, and they also are part of the attraction that women have for men, even though women don't have the same gains and sort of potentially enormous increases in reproductive success. They are probably more likely to be chosen if they can sing well, and there was a time in the upper middle class in the Victorian era when every young woman had to be able to draw and
right
and play the piano or the harpsichord and sing, and or you wouldn't get a husband. So these things may have started as spandrels, but I'm not sure of that either. I wouldn't be surprised if one of the key advantages and early advantages in the evolution of language was in courtship.
Yeah. Well, you also mentioned the book Big Gods, it's a kind of a hypothesis or theory about the origins of religion. Big Gods, which an 8-point summary: watched people are nice people. Religion is more in the situation than in the person. Hell is stronger than heaven. Trust people who trust in God. Religious actions speak louder than words. Unworshipped gods are impotent gods. Big gods for big groups, and religious groups cooperate in order to compete. So that's kind of an argument for an adaptive purpose. I don't know if it has to be group selection. I could see how it could still be individual selection at the group level, something like that. But that's making an argument for adaptive purposes to the various functions, like chanting together, dancing together, singing together, or virtue signaling. If I see you committed every week to doing these rituals, I know I can count on you when I need help, and vice versa, those sorts of things. And you talk about the big gods idea. If you have a pair of eyeballs watching you at the tip jar or something like that, people are more generous with their tips if they think, if you just put a mirror there, just somebody's watching you. So there's the theory that gods were invented as a way to impose morality on people before there was government and police and military to do it. What do you think of that?
Yeah, well, no, but I mean, the big gods hypothesis in particular is something that came along with government and police and military. It's about big societies and it's about the success of big societies. And I don't know if Noren Zion would say, well, it's cultural group selection, or what exactly he would say. I personally think there's always within any society, however coherent and however successful as a collective, there's always competition going on within it. And some people are benefiting more than others, whether your metric is wealth or reproductive success or attention or whatever it might be.
Yeah.
But one of the things, as I said, I set for myself is to try and understand everything from Buddhism to Hinduism, and the big gods are in between. Buddhism doesn't have any gods, at least strictly speaking, and it has morality. It has doesn't have a hell that's better than stronger than heaven, but it does have the opportunity to be reborn in a better state rather than a worse state. And you go to the other side and you have Hinduism, which has many gods, and people attribute, just like the ancient Greeks, although some Hindu theologians will say no, these are just different aspects of God. But if you go to India and you see people worshiping Shiva in one place and Vishnu in another place, and Saraswati and another place, you can see that they care about the individual identities and they care about their representations in the statues. So I don't know what to make of the fact that Buddhism succeeded in becoming a major religion through spread that included most of the same kinds of social and political and military methods that applied to Abrahamic religions and Christianity and Islam, at least. And Hinduism also succeeded in spreading to what is now 1 billion people without having one big god, and except maybe in Hinduism's earlier stage.
Yeah.
Well,
maybe not a single big god, but just the idea something's out there that knows we're here and is keeping track or something like that.
Right. Well, I tell the story of an elderly rabbi that I know has a great sense of humor, and he says he's in his 90s now. He once said, "God is an observant Jew," by which that's a double entendre.
Yeah, I got it. That's funny.
But the main thing he means is that God is watching him all the time.
Yeah.
And his sense of awe about that is what he described as the essence of his faith, and why he's an observant Jew. There is in Hinduism there are rewards and punishments, certainly, and you propitiate the gods, you make sacrifices.
Now you've been mildly
Buddhism. There's also rewards and punishments, and you're accumulating karma, which is not the same as having a pair of eyes on you, but it's a system of universal significance to every human being and every sentient being, where the system of rebirth is responding to the karma, positive or negative karma that you accumulate. So that part is true. Yeah.
Now, since we started Skeptic Magazine in '92, and the whole atheism issue has always been kind of up front, people are just incredibly interested in it. A lot of our readers would love every issue of Skeptic to be the special atheism issue, and it's like, there's more to life than atheism. I mean, it's not even a thing. It's just, I don't believe, full stop, now what? So I always describe myself as a skeptic or religious skeptic, and then a humanist or an Enlightenment humanist or secular humanist or scientific humanist, because it's a set of positive beliefs. So now one thing I've often worried about, positions that people sometimes take, like our founding fathers were mostly deists. They didn't really believe in a personal God, but they felt religion was good for people to have, for a self-governing people, because before the long arm of the law can reach out to the West, it's good that people have sort of an internal policeman monitoring their behavior. That's that kind of big gods argument. But I don't like it when we go down this path of, I don't believe, but the little people need to believe, because, they need that kind of self-assurance. To me, it feels a little elitist, so I try to avoid that kind of argument. I don't know what you think about that, because you don't believe, you're an atheist, I'm an atheist, but, we can have a debate about the role of religion in society, but I worry about us going down the path of, well, the little people need religion.
Yeah, well, Dawkins makes a very strong point, just like that, in his lectures and debates. And he says, "Oh well, us smart people, we don't need it, but those inferior types still need it, and we better let them have it, or else." I mean, first of all, you have people like Francis Collins, Nobel laureate, who's head of NIH, who is a born-again Christian and doesn't seem to interfere with his science or his intellectual power, and he's not clinging to God because of lack of intelligence, obviously. And that's true of a lot of big people as well. Now, I think that you look at the members of the National Academy of Sciences. A very small percentage are religious, and go down to a broader range of scientists. So it's a larger percentage, but I take the point that as science becomes more ubiquitous and accepted, the part of the religious community that has needed religion to explain things, like why do I get sick and why do we die and what happens after death and so on, those people objectively tend to become less likely to be religious. And so if you can see that as the health of a country improves, and the education of the country improves, the religiosity decreases. That's been a quite reliable phenomenon. The United States was a big exception until recently, but now we're, as you said earlier, we're catching up, and to Europe, we're starting to. I'm comfortable with that happening, but my inclination is. It's not because I'm contemptuous of people of faith that I want to just not yell at them to stop believing. It's I respect people's right to be different from me, and I would rather put my energy into promoting science and humanism, as you say, and scientific humanism. I share those views, and as you do in the Moral Arc, to promote the idea of that progress is real, that it's actually morally advantageous to have progress, and that's not that difficult to demonstrate. Look at facts. You did a good job with that. I rely on people's judgment to look at the evidence in favor of science, in favor of progress, in favor of humanism, and whether some of them retain their religious beliefs as they adopt those beliefs is neither here nor to me, as long as they stop swinging their arm when it gets near my nose.
That's right. Yeah. Principle of freedom applies there for sure. You're free to believe, I'm free to not believe, and we can each go on our ways. But if the trends continue, you just sort of wrapping up here toward the end of your book, you have a chapter title called "If Not Religion, What?" This is Bertrand Russell's question. And it's been a question since I've been really an adult. Like if we
actually Stephen Weinberg.
No, Stephen Weinberg. Yeah. So I mean, if we get to the point where religion has pretty much fallen into disuse, like it has in many European countries. My wife is from Cologne, Germany. Now the dome there, the big Catholic cathedral, is beautiful. It's very busy and active. But other cities where we go to, a lot of them are just empty. They're converted into concert halls, or that you can rent them out for business meetings, corporate parties, things like that. And I think, well, that'd be a good use. But of course, what Weinberg is after and you're after is no. But what are people filling it with? What's the hole being filled with? Now, since I've been an adult, there's been this kind of movement toward replacing religion with something like a humanist church in every city. Paul Kurtz had this idea when he founded the Center for Inquiry. Like they would build a building in every city in the United States and eventually the world where you could go to get married, for funerals, weddings and funerals and everything. Babysitting every Sunday. There's a meeting there, and there are these groups, and they get together on Sunday mornings and they sing hymns to Newton, and they light candles, and they have testimonials about how people lost their religion. Now, for me personally, I don't get anything out of these things because I'd rather be out on a mountain bike ride Sunday mornings. But I do recognize a lot of people, atheist friends of mine, do like that, including most of my Jewish friends are atheists, so they're kind of secular Jews, and they've maintained the culture of Judaism, the family, the community, the food, the holidays, and so on, without any of the God stuff. Walk us through what you see happening in the next century or so, and what would happen if the nun data continues that trend.
Well, I think that the attempt to create humanist societies is a perfectly positive, reasonable thing to do. Ethical Culture was the name of an international organization when I was younger. I don't know what the status of it is now, but it seems those people seem to recognize certain advantages in religion that they want to replace. One very important one is community. It's going to belonging to a group of people that you see on a regular basis that share your views and that care about each other. And then maybe you want to celebrate Darwin's birthday,
right.
Celebrate the Nobel Prizes every year, but maybe you want to have a hymnal that consists of beautiful songs that don't have to do with God, and maybe you want to have not a prayer book, but the equivalent of a book of secular or humanist readings that are inspiring, and that you could read at a meeting or a service like that. It seems to me you need to have something like that if you're going to answer the question, if not religion, what? And what happens if you don't have that, as you don't in most Western European countries, is that people drift into this sort of middle ground of what they call spirituality. They buy crystals. They do become witches, or they or warlocks in a very serious way.
I know a lot of these people.
They do all sorts of things like that. It's okay with me, but it seems to me to make sense if you're going to be serious about replacing religion, you have to do something positive, and you have to reproduce some of the positive attributes of religion, like community and mutual support and inspiration and traditions and explicit statements and even maybe singing about what you believe about life and the world and humanity.
What do you do for that? Personally,
well, I'm one of those Jews that still observes the cultural forms. And I think also literature has been very important to me. Theater is very important to me. So you go theater, live theater is a place where you go and really have a communal experience with other people who share your values to some extent, and you hear a story, you see a story enacted which has moral significance, emotional significance. You feel something, you laugh, you cry. It's that's a very important experience for me personally. I would before we finish just mention something about the chapter called Goodness in the book, which is, you mentioned that you can heighten people's altruism by calling attention to religious themes, and there are many studies like that now. They're not 100% consistent, but it's an empirical question whether religion contributes to altruism. One study that sticks in my mind is somebody did a test of ethics in a market, of ethical behavior in a market, and in an Islamic country, when the prayer was being chanted from the minaret, people were more altruistic in their. I don't remember what the game was.
It's a priming test. It's a priming experiment.
And then I also summarized a whole bunch of studies about the impact of religion on one's own health and illnesses. And again, it's not a uniform story, but there's a lot of evidence that people do better if they are religious participants and people of faith than not. Now, one of the things that is often said about this is it's just because you're going to these communal events and somebody says, "What's that spot on your neck?" Or You're not looking well this week. Don't you think you should? And that could just as well happen in a bowling league.
Social capital.
And that's probably true to some extent. But there are also studies that seem to show that faith itself is good for people of faith. That reawakening their faith during an illness can be helpful.
You have to actually believe. You can't just pretend you're believing.
Right, and you also have to not have a punitive idea of faith and God, because that will make you feel worse.
Well, maybe Buddhism is the way to go then, because you mentioned both David Barish and Bob Wright's book on Buddhism, Buddhist biology, and why Buddhism is true. I read Bob Wright's book. I didn't read David's book on Buddhist biology, but they both make the case that this is you have all the goods of religion without all the devils and the hells and the punishment, or maybe I'm not getting that quite right, but along the lines of what you just said, more of the positive aspects of religion without so much of the negative.
Yeah, well, I think both of those guys, I know them both, and respect them, like the books. They're basically talking about Buddhism light, LITE. As Americans,
the American version,
practice it, and
very Deepak-ish, I think, in that way. Deepak's a good friend, and his form of Buddhism, and Americans love it. It's easy to do.
And it also doesn't require. I mean, the Tibetan Buddhist monks and nuns that I met spend their lives in study. they remind me, except for celibacy, they remind me very much of the very serious rabbinical and Talmud scholars, Talmud and Torah scholars of my youth. They're buried in texts. They're meditating, but they will tell you that meditation doesn't really work unless you have a mastery of Buddhist texts and the knowledge base that you can meditate with and on.
Yeah. So getting back to where we started on the nature of human nature, I guess you would say that religion is very much an element of human nature, along with all the other characteristics we think of.
Provided we accept that it's not for everyone. And that we have to have a world that's, in my view, that's safe for not only religion but a variety of religions, in which they basically leave each other alone, which is certainly not the world we live in now.
Yeah,
and we have to have a world that's safe for atheists.
I hope
people
so.
who proclaim their atheism on the street corner, if they want to, should not be afraid, and should have a right to try and proselytize,
right?
Just like everybody else, if that's what they want to do.
But to be clear, that's not your thing. You would not actively pursue, atheism.
I proselytize science, and you could say that the particular branch of science of biological anthropology that I have devoted myself to is directed at, you might say it's directed at explaining the most hard to explain things about the human mind, the human spirit, human emotions, which many people have thought since the beginning humanity are inexplicable without reference to the supernatural.
Yeah.
And so my point of my writings and teaching has been very much directed at giving students and readers something else to use to explain human nature and human behavior, not something supernatural.
Yeah, that's right. Natural explanations. I wanted to ask you one final question that I mentioned in an email before we got on today about your opinion of the debate on how violent our ancestors were. Were they warlike? Were they peace-like? Were they more like chimps, or were they more like bonobos? I mentioned I was going to have I'm having on my podcast in a couple of weeks, Christopher Ryan with his book, Civilized to Death, The Price of Progress. He kind of pushes back against Pinker, mainly Pinker, and mainly in the point of contrasting current rates of violence with pre-state or horticulturalists or hunter-gatherers or whatever. Depends on who you're talking about there. But in any case, the people he quotes argue that Pinker cherry-picked certain hunter-gatherer groups that were more violent and then left off the other ones. Of course, Pinker says that's not what he did, and he has a huge database. And you know all the literature better than I do, and it goes back and forth. But just as a biological anthropologist, on this question, how violent are we by nature? Obviously, we have inner demons. Obviously, we have better angels. It's complicated. But what's your kind of sense of how life was like before civilization in terms of violence versus today?
Well, starting with the Tangled Wing, which came out in the first edition in 1982, I asserted very strongly that violent tendencies are a part of human nature, and that far from it being the case, which some people claim, that this justifies violence, I claim that without a full recognition of these inclinations in ourselves, we have no hope of ever controlling violence.
Yeah.
My experience with the Bushmen confirmed that these are universal tendencies, and you see anger arising, see occasionally man bring out his poisoned arrows and brandish them at somebody else over a difference of opinion. a meat distribution or a difference of opinion over a woman. This is in every society. There is no society that does not have homicide. There's no archaeological record that's devoid of homicide.
Yeah.
I think the Better Angels of Our Nature is a wonderful book. I like it very much, and I only take issue with one point. I think Pinker clearly demonstrates that from ancient times to the early agricultural civilizations until today, there has been a steady decline in every form of violence. Very hard for some people to believe that it's all about the denominator. It's all about, the rate of violence, which is what matters. It doesn't matter that we killed more people in the 20th century than they killed in the 7th century. It matters that if you were living in the 20th century, you had a much higher rate of having a violent-free life than you did at any time in the past, especially the distant past. So my only issue with him is extrapolating the line backward into the hunting and gathering phase of our history. It's not that I think that the hunter-gatherers weren't violent, and you have a discussion of that really pretty well covers the basis, and
thanks.
And there's no doubt that there are homicides in every society and in every phase of history. It is possible that homicides rates were higher among our hunter-gatherer ancestors than they are in later stages, probably than they are today. But the study of Brian Soderbergh was published in Science, where they're really directed, their attention is directed at organized violence. And so here's an important distinction that I make in answer to that question. I have no problem believing that there was a lot of homicidal violence in the hunting and gathering period. But they make a case, and others have done that, that it wasn't organized. And I often say that if hunter-gatherers had less organized violence than later societies, it's not because they were less violent; it's because they were less organized. And,
okay, that's a good way to put it.
Right, but it makes a difference when I mentioned this. You referred to Brian Ferguson, who has a collection of archaeological papers about the Old World, which in many places seem to show an increase in violent deaths with the settlement of advanced hunter-gatherers and then the advent of agriculture. Patricia Lambert shows something very similar in the Indians of California, very meticulous analysis of the archaeological record. Plenty of violence and homicide in the hunting-gathering phases, but more with the advent of settled agriculture. And certainly, as you say in your typology of civilization, this is when you get the opportunity for real class distinctions, for societies that are social pyramids, for injustice, for disparities in wealth, and those things. I don't say there's not inequality or people trying to take advantage of each other among the Bushmen. There are. I'm saying that systematic realization of that and the difference between the gender roles and so on becomes much more intense after you get so-called civilization, and we're still trying to recover from that first phase of complex society, which was severely hierarchical, hereditary,
slavery,
equal slavery, serfdom.
Well, this is part of the argument that Christopher makes in his book, that the hunter-gatherer life was actually pretty good. Now, he's not proposing we go back to that. You can't get rid of 7.5 billion people, but that a more horizontal instead of vertical society, where women have a better role, where sex is freer, where children are more autonomous and free to play, and particularly where there's less income inequality and wealth disparity. So sort of a far left progressive, kind of a Bernie type argument, although I don't know what Christopher's politics are, but probably along those lines, to kind of counter some of those negative aspects of civilization, which you just mentioned, very hierarchical, huge wealth disparities and so on, which are not good for health and happiness to people. If you had a chance to live for permanently and give up your beautiful home I can see you have there and go live with the Bushmen again for the rest of your life, say you were 25 or 30, would you do it? Or on balance, does civilization, at least now, outweigh living in a society like that?
I would certainly not do it, and I don't think that any honest person would, with a even a much less sumptuous lower middle class life than I have, would change places knowingly with anyone in any past society.
Okay.
It would
even
be
hunter gatherers, even 100,000 years ago.
And I mean, you'd have to specify that I wouldn't have half my children dying before they grow up,
Right.
for one thing. I mean, you can ask Christopher Ryan about that. I mean, but also, people are well adapted to that way of life, but there are great advantages to our way of life, and I think that just as they did in Sex at Dawn, there's a certain romantic quality about primitive societies that I think you should ask Christopher Ryan about. You can ask him if he would really change places with
I'll ask him that. Yeah.
Or Hadzar and Aceh. I think the thrust of hunter-gatherer research in modern anthropology has been to show clearly that their lives are much better than most people thought.
Right.
And much richer, much more full of humor and a variety of emotions, a variety of personalities, mutual support, and real sense of community and tradition and religious ceremonies, like I said, and decorations and music and it's not solitary poor.
Yeah, nasty British and short. Yeah.
And it's not even short if you live past childhood.
Right.
So it's very important to make that distinction. And when you mention the things that you mentioned, less inequality. Yes, there's inequality, but it's much less. So there's some anthropologists have tried to measure wealth differences in hunter-gatherers, and it comes out to be like twofold.
Okay.
As opposed to 1,000-fold
right.
in the United States. Certainly, women are not 100% equal to men, but they have more of a voice in a small-scale society because they can't be excluded from conversations, and they make too big a contribution, and there is a sense of automatic sharing of wealth, which doesn't erase that last twofold difference in wealth, but it does prevent.
But those are good things.
Starving, yes, those are all good things, and you mentioned Bernie Sanders. I mean, we don't think we want to get into a political discussion, but certainly for me, the sort of liberal democratic social welfare state is a laudable goal, which can in some ways be thought of as a return to the greater egalitarianism that existed in our hunter-gatherer past. I don't think we would want to have a society that was completely leveled.
Right.
I think that requires. Well, you have a quotation from Hayek about that. That requires autocracy.
Right. Right.
Truly stamp out people's tendency to want to excel and stand out and get more to some extent. And I always say that the real question. I remember talking to one of the famous Berkeley free speech movement guys in the summer of 1965. I was there. We were in a coffee on Telegraph Avenue.
You were? Wow.
And I was saying, well, I think that the communist societies and the capitalist societies are most likely to converge on something like the Scandinavian.
Yeah.
And I think that would be okay. And he said, yeah, but Mel, somewhere there's a Mr. Volvo.
Mr. Volvo.
I realized in that moment that I did not care if there was a Mr. Volvo.
Right.
What I cared about was that Mr. Volvo couldn't pull the floor out from under the poorest people in the society. That it's not about how successful or wealthy some people can get. It's about how high you build the floor under the poor.
Yes, right.
And the least advantaged, and that would be a salutary return to hunter-gatherer.
There, I think you and Christopher would be in large agreement. My wife, I mentioned, is from Germany. They have universal health care. They have, you get maternity leave, and if you fall out of employment, they have pretty good employment placement and temporary money for maintaining your housing while you're unemployed, and so on. Lots and lots of social security there for everybody. And I don't see why we can't emulate their system, because they're the most powerful economy in the entire EU by far. So apparently you're able to do this without ruining your economy.
Yes, I agree with that completely. And now you just have to go and try and convince some of your neighbors in Orange County. Is that where you are?
Well, I'm in Santa Barbara now, which is fairly liberal, I think.
Yeah, it's. I'll tell you, I think there is one reality to American exceptionalism as a culture, and it's not necessarily positive, but it's not necessarily negative either. It's not the frontier in our history. It's the fact that the huge majority of Americans are descended from somebody who are somebody who was self-selected to come here.
Right.
And that can't be a random selection of the populations that they came, whether it be China, Japan, Italy,
except for Africa,
Europe, except for Africa, and to some extent the Latino populations whose ancestors were absorbed into the United States in the Mexican War that produced your state or half of it.
Right, half of it. Texas, we got to give it back.
Well, yeah, I had a great drawing. I can't remember who sent it to me. Which said, yes, we should build a border wall, and it had a brightly colored image of North America with a wall along the border that existed
way back in the
United States and Mexico in 1840.
That would have been most of Texas, New Mexico, and Southern California, about half of California. Yeah, that's right.
I don't think Americans want that wall.
No. Well, Mel, I want to be mindful of your time, and I've got to go off and record another podcast. But again, congratulations on the new book. I loved reading it, Believers, Faith in Human Nature. I highly recommend it. It's a great read.
I truly appreciate your interest, Michael.
Super interesting conversation. We've covered pretty much all the big topics. Now we just have to wait for all the hate to come down on our shoulders on social media.
I'm surprised about how much we agreed, actually.
Yeah, actually quite a bit. All right, Mel. Well, you have a good weekend. Thanks again for coming on. All right.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.